to 1946. However, like with World War One, like with other eras in the history of the U.S., we have to first unpack stuff that's happened prior to the beginning of the war and stuff that will happen and events that will take place following the end of the war. So, your questions to ponder. They're very short in this case. Why the Allies won the war? How did the failures from World War One contribute to World War Two? How did the political world shift during and after? What happens at the conferences? How did the Allies deal with the end of World War Two? And then how did war change life in the U.S.? So let's recap the U.S. situation first. So first, we need to look at the fact that the U.S. obviously was in the Great Depression, right? FDR took office in 1933, New Deal programs began, and America was slowly back on the rise. We find that, and we know that the New Deal is not the reason, or at least the only reason why the U.S. was able to build back out of the Depression. The war will end up taking a bigger role and have a bigger impact there. All right, so a short timeline of events that I want us to look at. Right, first, Benito Mussolini, who's the leader of Italy during World War II, for the most part, he loses power in 1943, takes power in 1922. His is a fascist regime. He's an extreme nationalist. Right, he wants to grow the country militarily as well. In 1933, same year as FDR takes office, Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. By March of that year, he'll be a dictator in Germany. Concentration camps are begun, and these are initially built to house any opponents of Hitler. Japan and Germany will end up leaving the League of Nations that year as well, over obviously fundamental differences with the rest of the League, not getting what they felt to be their fair share. Right, the League, we know, is one of the reasons that leads us to the war. The failure of the League of Nations, that is. In 1934, the Soviet Union will join the League of Nations. The Nazi Party will continue growing in power and scope. Hitler is now saying, okay, I've grown the military. I have an SS, a secret police division. I am basically clamping down on anyone who is speaking out against me at this point. In 1935, they'll begin persecuting Jews, right? Finding the German Jewish population and just Jews in general as being, the enemy there. Additionally, the U.S. at that point will pass a Neutrality Act, basically saying, hey, and this is a series of Neutrality Acts that have been passed and will continue to be passed, hey, anyone who's at war, anyone who's in a conflict, yeah, we're not trading with you. We're not getting involved, right? We're going to remain isolationist. They will later amend that, obviously, to help the Allies prior to entering the war themselves. In 1936, Germany will violate the Treaty of Versailles, which again said, basically curtail your military. You're not allowed to expand beyond these borders, right? You're basically confined to this space. Well, when he takes the Rhineland, it's the first act of aggression, really. One of the first acts of aggression by Hitler in Germany. And it's ignored for the most part. It's ignored because, as you see in 1938, there's a policy of appeasement going on. Basically, and this is done by the British and French towards Germany. They don't want a war. And when Hitler's like, yeah, I'm only going here because there's a German population, I feel like they should be within the borders of Germany, right? The two countries of Britain and France are like, okay, as long as you promise this is as far as you'll go and we'll let it happen, there'll be no more aggression, no war. All right, so what's the international outlook then? One, the League of Nations is inefficient and unreliable. Nothing gets done. The smaller countries are basically not getting their fair share or their fair shake when it comes to conflicts. Additionally, larger countries don't want to have to say, oh, I have a problem. Can we as the international community deal with this together? They want to deal with it on their own. The U.S. is remaining isolationist, right? They don't have the means to be in a war. They don't want to be in a war because, one, they're still recovering from the Great Depression, and two, They saw what happened in World War One. It's never been the policy of the U.S. to get into a war just because. There are revolutions and changes in power in Europe. Mussolini take power in Italy, Hitler in Germany. The Spanish Civil War takes place in the 30s, and that will result in Francisco Franco coming into power. And then appeasement is allowing Hitler to expand his hopes. Appeasement is done with the hopes of achieving peace as a goal. So the war begins. First, late August, Germany and the Soviet Union sign a non-aggression pact known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where basically they say, we're not going to attack each other. It keeps the Soviet Union out of Germany's way when they begin their assault. They also say, look, we're going to go after Poland, and we're going to split Poland and share it with you. And this happens on September 1st of 1939. So it's pretty much bang, bang. Sign this pact, great. Now we're going to attack. And it's a blitzkrieg. And a blitzkrieg is basically an all-out attack. It's very fast. It involves land, air, sea, right? Whatever means you need to reach that goal are done. Italy will join Germany's side. Britain and France will declare war on Germany. However, there'll be a bit of a stalemate. And then a whole host of issues will begin to unfold in terms of, okay, what do we do about the sovereignty of Poland, smaller countries? Who's siding with who? What's Hitler's next move going to be, right? And the U.S. is obviously still monitoring this now from a distance. Real quick, your Axis and allies. Your Axis first have Italy, Germany, and Japan. Japan, obviously, in Asia will join forces with Germany and Italy, despite the fact that it really won't be involved in Europe. They're just trying to grow their own power. Again, they were not happy with the terms of Versailles. They had worked on expanding. They attacked China and Manchuria, largely looked down upon, especially by the U.S. The Soviet Union is in purple because they initially joined the Axis and then switched to the Allies once Germany attacks them. And then on the Allied side, it's the same big three as it was in World War I, with Great Britain and France first, and then the U.S. will join later on in 1941. All right, causes of the war. Right, you guys went over this and then actively learned failure of the Treaty of Versailles. No one monitored or policed Germany. Germany was also hit hard with sanctions, and as point 3 goes, with the Great Depression, everyone was hurt economically. No one could pay back the reparations or the loans. There was, a suspension of trade. The U.S. is in no position now to even do anything about this growing threat in Europe. Again, everyone wanted to appease Germany, let Hitler do what he wanted to do. There's a rise of dictators, totalitarian dictators in Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin, and Franco, who want to basically consolidate all power, make sure it's run under them. That's it. Just one ruler, final say, turned into a police state at times too. And then, as a byproduct of the Treaty of Versailles, you have the failure of the League of Nations. All right, so right here, this image, or the 3 images show on the top right, the Blitzkrieg. You see some air assault, land assault through tanks and infantry. Hitler meeting one of his officers after the fact. At the bottom is basically the remnants of part of Poland following this attack. And on the left-hand side, you can see the map, right? You see the fact that Poland is invaded on the left by Germany, right? The Soviets come in through the right. And while it's given its new Poland question mark, right? It's bit of sovereignty that's not going to stay, right? It doesn't matter. Warsaw is targeted as the big area, right? It's the capital there. And they will keep moving west, while the Soviets will have part of the east. All right, so Germany targets France and Britain afterwards. As mentioned, France and Britain declare war, and in 1940, then, Germany will start going after them. There's this line on the east of France known as the Maginot Line, basically a bunch of fortifications that means to keep Germany out and kind of at bay. The hopes here are that France and Britain can reinforce that line, make sure they can just essentially stare down Germany until it backs up, right? And it is kind of just a stare down at first. Eventually, though, as with the Blitzkrieg operations, Germany goes into France. They then will take the Netherlands and Denmark to allow them greater access to the coast of Britain. So France falls, was attacked and necessarily falls, quote unquote, in June of 1940. A Vichy France government is set up by the Nazis, so they have a government in Vichy France. Between the summer and fall of 1940, Britain will be bombed, specifically London, by the German Air Force known as the Luftwaffe. Map over here will show, right in yellow, the Axis-controlled areas. By 1941, we see France, we see Poland, of course, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Norway, and Denmark, Netherlands, going down into the Balkan region as well. Germany will also push right into part of the Soviet Union. Not great. Doesn't do well for the alliance between them. Now, this is a goal of Hitler's, of course, but doesn't do well. And then Italy's campaign is largely moving into northern Africa. You'll see Turkey, Spain, Portugal, Switzerland, and Sweden and Ireland all remain neutral by 1941. All right, so your European allied leaders. We have Charles de Gaulle out of France. He is a general turned president of France. He operates his government in exile from Great Britain, basically saying, yeah, France lost the battle, but they didn't lose the war, right? They won't be defeated by Germany. Winston Churchill is the Prime Minister of Great Britain. He comes in after Neville Chamberlain, and he leads with more of an assertiveness. Right? He uses his platform to rally the Allies, unite the Allies, basically saying, look, we will not surrender to Germany or to the Axis powers. We will fight on, because Germany tries to be like, hey, sign this, surrender essentially, and we'll stop attacking. Churchill goes, no, right? There's no reason for us to surrender. We won't. And Stalin, as mentioned, he is a totalitarian dictator of the Soviet Union who begins as an Axis power, but will switch to the Allies following 1940 when Germany attacks. All right, so the Holocaust is probably the most significant event regarding the war. It is a systemic persecution and extermination of the Jewish population. It's a genocide. The Nuremberg laws are put in place that basically say we can take away Jewish citizenship, we can jail you, we can destroy your houses and businesses, we can separate your families, whatever it is, for whatever reason we want. The Germans felt they needed a scapegoat for all of the hardships, so they targeted the Jews. As you see on the left-hand side, that's where all the camps would have been. The most significant or well-known camps are Dachau, Buchenwald. In Poland, we have Auschwitz and Birkenau, and then Treblinka as well. In these camps, and you notice that none of the killing centers are within the borders of Germany. They wanted them all essentially within the borders of Poland. Within these camps, we have political opponents of Hitler, but now we have a huge number of Jews that, again, are exterminated. They are put in gas chambers. They have different experiments run on them, right? It's a working camp, but at the same time, it's, essentially a death sentence, no matter which camp you end up going to. On Kristallnacht, that's basically the night of broken glass. That's when the Nazis go through Germany, right? They go through Poland, and they basically say, okay, you're a Jew, you're coming with us, right? It's the hunting down of them. It's taking them in the dead of night. Photos here will show, obviously, the young boys in concentration camps, the separation of families on the right and on the right-hand side at the top and bottom. Of course, the elderly are killed immediately, as are toddlers and infants. Anyone who can work is then passed through. They separate the men and women into different camps in different areas. where they have different roles, but again, are living under constant fear, not just because they're in a prison, but because of the treatment that is shown. So we've heard the numbers before. 6 million Jews, around 6 million Jews are killed in the concentration camps between 1939 and 1945, right? While Hitler's in power, while they have these concentration camps that they're taking the Jews and putting them in. A large number of them you see from this table are from Poland. However, it wasn't just the Jews, right? 5 million others also die in the Holocaust. And these are those political opponents. These are those who are gypsies or who just didn't join the Nazi party. Those who were prisoners of war, right? So total, we have somewhere around 11 million deaths occur in the concentration camps. America's response. Okay, you went over this as well. They want isolationism, right? They embrace isolationism. They're not in a position for war. They turn a blind eye. They don't approve of what Hitler's doing, but we're also not going to get involved. We're not going to accept Jews that are trying to find some sort of refuge in the U.S. They disapprove of Hitler's actions again, but they don't take any action against it. As you'll recall, the U.S. also is pretty discriminatory themselves, right? They have an anti-Semitism policy of sorts. Fear of the other, of course, is still playing a role with social Darwinism. And once again, we're not prepared for conflict. The two most important acts that the U.S. kind of puts into play here are the Neutrality Act. Again, they signed a series of those, but in 1939, they start saying, okay, fine, we'll start selling goods, doing what we can for the Allies without getting involved. The other one is the Lend-Lease Act. We'll give goods, war materials, information, whatever it is, to any nation that basically helps protect the United States. So again, the theory here, or the way of thinking here, is we will help the Allies out because we see the German threat as an actual threat that could hurt our defense and our safety. And so, we might as well get involved in that. Same with the fact that they have Japan on their other side. Right, on the Atlantic, you have Europe, and on the Pacific, you have Asia. Not a good position to be in. Continuing that, right, Roosevelt gives his Four Freedoms speech where he basically lays out that it's a moral imperative to help the Allies. Help the Allies without going to war. They cut off treaties with Japan because Japan has, again, gone into China. They're not listening to the fact that the U.S. is like, hey, back out. You shouldn't be doing this. They'll cut off supplies. They'll embargo the oil. And again, they will continue to push for helping their allies without having to, quote unquote, risk American lives. Well, then we have Japan, the U.S., and Pearl Harbor, where the growing tensions will kind of lead to, one, an intercepted message by the U.S. basically saying, okay, hey, Japan, we're going to attack the U.S. It doesn't say when, it doesn't say where. This is done and led by Hideki Tojo, who is a military officer as well as Prime Minister of Japan. And peace talks are underway to try to dissolve any sort of conflict that could happen. And so they break down, and they break down on December 6th, 1941. In the early morning hours of December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor is attacked. This is the U.S.'s largest naval base. It's located in Hawaii, and it catches the U.S. off guard with about 180 Japanese planes coming in. It's at this moment, right, the very next day, FDR will ask for his declaration of war. He will get it from Congress. 3 days later, Germany declares war on the U.S., and now by December 10th, December 11th, the U.S. is officially in World War II. Photos from Pearl Harbor show the destruction of ships, show the destruction of planes, the fact that these soldiers and the sailors are largely caught off guard, right? They have nothing that they can do at this point. On the right-hand side, we have the USS Arizona. This stands as one of the monuments still there at Pearl Harbor if you go visit. So on the home front, right, immediately we mobilize for war. We have a selective service draft, basically. It's not a wartime draft. It was a peacetime draft. It was basically, yes, all men had to register, but it wasn't like, okay, every man now will have to go fight. Every year, a certain number is picked to join. Of course, millions of volunteers already signed up to join the military. George Marshall will mobilize these armed forces. Right? He will also say, look, we need to have a women's auxiliary army corps, which permits women to join the military in non-combat roles, basically doing any sort of other jobs necessary. That could be tending to soldiers. That could be, cooking for the soldiers. That can be, helping to transport material, right? Whatever it is, ammunition, guns, weapons, right? Women can volunteer for this, and they do. Minorities have a differing view on the war. A majority of them will say, okay, it's for nationalism and it's for, basically ensuring that safety is not lost with Hitler, basically growing his power, right? We don't want to have Hitler doing this. But at the same time, Native Americans, Japanese Americans, Mexican Americans, and specifically, or most importantly, African Americans are still largely disenfranchised, right? They find it ironic to a sense that they're fighting a war to protect another group of people, despite the fact that they don't have full rights themselves. So it presents a very interesting challenge here. In managing the war effort, right, propaganda makes a return. These are the posters that call for enlisting, call for war production, call for bonds, anything to help out with the war effort. Additionally, to combat inflation, the U.S. freezes prices on goods. They expand the income tax. So unfortunately, now a lot of people don't have the money to buy what they want to buy. But the government also puts in the War Production Board. And this basically will allocate the raw materials to industries saying, okay, I need this built or I need this manufactured. Additionally, that board will dictate who's going to be peacetime and who's going to be wartime in terms of what their job as a business factory industry would be. A lot of businesses will switch over to wartime, but the War Productions Board will oversee this. They will ration goods because, again, the soldiers need it more than the American public is the feeling. So we need to make sure that we ration food, ration whatever critical materials we need to send over. And they'll mobilize scientists, which is crucial because that will be the beginning of what will be known as the Manhattan Project. All right, so the responding workforce, as mentioned, a lot of companies, a lot of people will switch to wartime production. It's such a dramatic switch, and production is so efficient that they can build ships within 24 days and send them out, right? So many people are joining this war effort because it's a war effort that's meant to curtail fascism, curtail the Nazi Party, and bring peace, right? Aid in a humanitarian way. And again, defend the borders of the United States. The expanded opportunities for women will lead 6 million women to join the workforce. Again, all falling under nationalism. Rosie the Riveter will be the most looked upon symbol of the women's movement here, right? She's used as a symbol of a feminist movement, of a movement for equality and greater opportunity for women, even following the war. The response to Japanese Americans is pretty much seen as the same it's been every time the U.S. has chosen to vilify a group of people. A huge wave of discrimination washes over Japanese Americans, similar and adding to those numbers of African Americans, Native Americans, and other minorities, where it is decided that the best policy is to take Japanese Americans, despite the fact that they signed on to fight the war effort for the U.S., and put them in internment camps. Essentially put them in a prison-based camp, but it would also be looking like what would be similar to a Native American reservation, right? You're just all going to be put in this one area. It's dubbed a necessity for national security, right? It's necessary because we need to protect ourselves in war. Korematsu v. United States will be a Supreme Court case, which I won't go into depth with this time, that basically finds internment constitutional. It's constitutional because it's a wartime necessity, similar to the cases that we saw during World War One, the Schenck case, the Debs case, where it's a wartime protection to curtail free speech. Well, in this case, it's a wartime necessity to place Japanese Americans who could be, quote unquote, sympathetic to Japan into internment camps. All right, so back in Europe, right on the west, Germany is dealing with Great Britain, France, and the US. On the east, they now have to deal with the Soviet Union. They try to go towards Stalingrad, which is the capital of the Soviet Union. This is a failed attempt by the Germans. The Soviets will win in 1943. However, 1.1 million Soviets will also die in this conflict, more than the total number of American soldiers that die in the war. It also marks a turning point, though, in Europe. It's a turning point because now Germany is backing up, and the Soviet Union begins to march towards Germany. Moving into North Africa, the Allies are able to fairly easily wipe out Italian control. Mussolini will lose his power by 1943. And then the Allies, much like how the Axis had said it, the Allies are going to aim for unconditional surrender. Nothing short of basically saying we're done, we're ending this war, is good enough. I want to highlight one crucial group of American soldiers, in this case airmen, known as the Tuskegee Airmen. This is the first all-black air squadron. They are trained in the United States, and they fly numerous missions within World War II. They are shown as a symbol of unity and nationalism against the Axis threat. They're shown as American soldiers, American heroes. They are seen as heroes by also Britain and France, and they emphasize the impact of minorities in the war effort, showing that this is not just a war fought by white soldiers. It is fought and won and helped greatly by minorities. All right, we all know about D-Day. D-Day is the largest operation ever, the largest assault ever. On June 6, 1944, known as Operation Overlord, the Allies will storm the beaches of Normandy, France, to kind of break the German wall, right, to get into France, to help France as well. Dwight Eisenhower leads the Allied war effort. And ultimately what happens here, while it is an assault that leads to many casualties on both sides, of course, it does break a hole in, or opens a gap in Germany's line for George Patton and his Third Army, mainly an artillery army as well, to go in and advance. Whereas in the Pacific, we're seeing Japanese forces advance very quickly, expand very quickly. And Douglas MacArthur is put in charge in the Allied forces in the Pacific. One of the tactics that's employed is island hopping. This is basically saying we're going to go to this island because it's not heavily fortified by the Japanese. We're going to establish it as a Allied base. It allows for Allied troops to then land there, whatever it is, have any resources there before we jump to another island. Right, it's monopolizing the islands, if you want to look at it that way, before launching the full-scale attack towards Japan. Battle of Midway takes place June 3rd, 1942. It's the U.S. bombing of a Japanese fleet. It's essentially seen as retribution as well by the U.S. for what happened in Pearl Harbor. Iwo Jima is that site of the famous picture of the Marines setting the flag. It is a memorial as well in Arlington, Virginia, if you ever go down and visit that. This campaign essentially showed the force of the Marines, able to take down a force of over 20,000 Japanese scattered throughout the island. where they were able to claim it for a U.S. victory, allowing them to again chip away at the control Japan had, moving then into Okinawa as well. All right, so ending the war. So first, the Allies officially move in. They're able to secure and liberate the war camps and the death camps in Poland, right? The concentration camps are liberated. There's the Yalta Conference that takes place prior to the end of the war. And this will have Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt meet there to discuss the terms, basically say, hey, let's not go too hard on Germany because we don't want the same thing happening again. But let's also decide what we're going to do about breaking Germany up. And then, hey, Stalin, this is from Roosevelt's point, hey, Stalin, can you help us in the Pacific? Marching into Germany, Hitler is ultimately defeated, right? He takes his own life. However, conspiracy theory goes that his body was never found. We're not going to get into that, of course. So Victory in Europe Day, though, happens May 8th, 1945. So just over 75 years ago. Weeks ago, right? Because, what is it, May 28th now? And Truman becomes president April 12th of 1945. So actually, Roosevelt never got to see the end of the war. Roosevelt has a stroke and dies. On April 12th, Truman will become president that same night. The Manhattan Project is put into place, led by a scientist named Robert Oppenheimer, J. Robert Oppenheimer, and they develop the atomic bomb, which Truman sees as obviously a terrifying development, but a necessary one, right? He says, well, this weapon can be used not only in furthering science and peace, but it can establish the fact that we need to end this war. And they drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, leading to the Victory in Japan Day, August 15th of 1945, though the official surrender will happen in 41, or September 1st of 1946. 1945. A formal surrender by Japan is in 1945 in September. This is challenges of victory. Also in 1943, an idea was floated around for an international body to basically deal with humanitarian conflicts and deal with, make sure no big conflict like this happens again. By 1945, that charter will be signed and will come to be known as the United Nations, arguably stronger international body than that of the League of Nations. The Potsdam Conference happens in July of 1945, this time showing Stalin there as the only returning member, joined by Harry Truman and Clement Attlee of Great Britain. And in this case, Stalin kind of flexes. He says, look, here's how we want things done. First, we're going to divide Germany up into 4 quadrants. It's going to be controlled by the Allies. This is where you have your Berlin Wall basically set up. Additionally, right, Stalin's going to dictate a lot of the terms of what's going to happen in the East. Right? Sure, he'll still help with ending, the Japanese threat, but this is setting up the stage for a new geopolitical conflict known as the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The Nuremberg trials will happen between November of 1945 and October of 1946, where they'll try and either imprison or execute numerous Nazi officials, officers, party leaders, soldiers who are committed of war crimes. And then Japan is occupied by the U.S., led by Douglas MacArthur for about 7 years. And in this occupation, Japan will become more democratic. Right? They will have a new constitution. They will have more rights for women. They will have elections. Right? This is going to be one of the challenges, though, that the U.S. has to face there. So what's our legacy of the war? Our legacy of the war is as follows. 2 superpowers have emerged, the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Again, this will now lead to the Cold War because it's basically a standoff for between 1945 to 1991-92, where both sides are threatening nuclear aggression, but it's also an ideological war between communism and capitalism and freedom on the side of the U.S. Germany is divided, as mentioned, into 4 sectors. The UN has created all of these kind of steps to correct the failures of World War I, where now the U.S. and the Allies can monitor Germany to no end. They can make sure that they have control over the military, that they make sure that something's going to get done. The economy is also revamped in the U.S., right? The Depression is largely over. Also, during the war, there was mass migration, people seeking refuge, but also people coming into work during the war, while a lot of men went off to fight. Women have new opportunities. Minorities as well have new opportunities that they saw were now available to them due to this war. And finally, the GI Bill of Rights is passed, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. This will correct what happened with World War I with the Bonus Army March by saying, look, here's basically education opportunities, here's training opportunities, here's a way to reassimilate back into life. So that will bring us to the end of World War II. Right, keep in mind this legacy and how it shapes future policies and the ideology of the U.S. going forward as well.